So I remind you, last time we looked at that video on the crash of the stock market in 1929, and the fact that the American economy fell into a very deep depression, which took literally more than a decade to recover from. The decade of the 1930s, from the fall of that crash in 1929 to the beginning of World War II in Europe, was a reactionary period of conservatism alongside severe economic depression in the United States. Many American artists increasingly, now we saw the distaste for European modernism at the time of the Armory Show in 1913, but many American artists increasingly felt contempt for European formalism and began to consciously reject anything that was introduced from the outside that was a European trend or European tradition. There was increasingly this desire to create, to embrace a native American art that could express the commitment to American values and culture and social issues. Artists, and especially painters, whom we've come to concentrate on in this class, create works with naturalistic depictions of contemporary American life. And throughout much of the 30s, we can categorize these artists as what are called American scene painters. So they turn to American life and American tradition. One specific strongly nationalistic group of artists were eventually known as the regionalists. In other words, certain artists came out of certain regions of the country, and they represented their regions in their art. So they're called regionalists. So they're among the so-called American scene painters. Their works were strongly based on a desire to use the American world as a kind of propaganda for what is in life hardworking, puritanical, all American in terms of subject. Among the artists who's associated with the regionalists is Edward Hopper. He was actually a student of Robert Henri, so he goes back in terms of his tradition to the realism and that sort of that early generation of American artists in the early 19th century. Hopper had traveled to France between 1906 and 1910. Now, between 1906 and 1910, you'd be very hard-pressed not to find out about Cubism. But he doesn't seem to have been much influenced in his trip to France by modernist movements such as Cubism or even Fauvism. Hopper was fascinated with the urban scene, although he is also known to have created some landscape paintings as well. Over and over again, the subjects of his paintings seem to reflect on an innate loneliness and isolation. Perhaps this is that sort of angst that we talked about, remember, in terms of German expressionist art. I'm not trying to say he was influenced by that. I'm trying to say there's that same sense going on here. The stock market has crashed. America is in the throes of the beginnings of a depression. It's now 1930. He represents a street in New York City early Sunday morning, and there's not a person to be seen. Now, the fact is that many people sleep late on Sunday morning, and that certainly is fine. But Hopper has reduced everything, no details really, or hardly any details, the bare essentials, in order to force us to think about the absence of any life. Not even one window in the upper part of these shops, one after the other. Not one window up above where the people who maybe run the shop live, or people have rented up there. You don't get the sense that anyone is there. So again, I'm talking about this in the context of, we've talked about the angst of German Expressionism, that sense of alienation, that sense of loss, which can certainly be part, or said to have been part of the American experience by this time. I think we would have to say that early Sunday morning has to some extent been reduced down to certain essentials, that the formal qualities, the use of shape, flat color areas, the reduction of detail is certainly modern. But there's a rather brilliant use of light. The sun is just coming up. You have this low, the sun low in the sky, this raking angle of light and some shadow coming down. And yet it's all been simplified. The most well-known regionalist painter is Grant Wood. His most iconic, most well-known work is American Gothic, also painted in 1930. Like the other regionalists, Wood was a boy from the Midwest. He was from Cedar Rapids, Iowa. He had studied art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, and he had studied art in Europe. And despite the fact that he had studied at the Art Institute, where he had a very traditional training, despite the fact that he had gone to Europe to study art, he really was not at all interested in European modernism. He was not interested in abstraction. In fact, he was more strongly influenced by artists such as Jan van Eyck, that is Flemish Renaissance painters. Do you remember that Van Eyck takes us all the way back to Ingres, who was very much influenced by the kind of detail in a Van Eyck, the emulation of surface texture, the attention to modeling of form, all of that kind of miniaturism and realism of detail comes out of that interest in Flemish painting of the Renaissance and gets used here for a work such as American Gothic. The title of the work comes from the very distinctive looking, very typical looking house out in the country, a farmhouse, which has a Gothic ogival or pointed arch window in the upper story area. It's right between the heads of the two figures who are represented in the foreground. This is basically a double portrait, and some critics at the time assumed that the painting was meant as a kind of caricature, sort of maybe making fun of small-time farmers, but that wasn't the intent at all as far as Wood was concerned. Let me ask you something, just to find out from you. So this is a double portrait. Who are these people? I mean, you don't have to tell me specifically, obviously, but if you're reading, you know, we've read a lot of paintings now in this class. What's the relationship of these people? Who are they? I mean, I know one is the male, one's the female, one is the farmer. Why do I come to that conclusion? He's holding a pitchfork. Yes, okay, and wearing overalls, perhaps. Okay, so who are they in relation to each other? Sorry? Married, husband and wife. Okay, what else? Father and daughter. What else? So those are probably the two that one would tend to guess. But people were really very interested to know who they were and if they were a real couple and or what was going on. The fact is, and it's quite fascinating, Wood specifically chose individuals whom he thought would reflect on sort of the heartland of America, because that's what he wanted to represent here. So that man is actually his dentist, or a dentist in a town nearby, and that's his sister Nan. And Nan was many years, perhaps 20 years younger than the dentist. And she was supposedly always offended when people thought it was a husband and wife because she was so much younger. Anyway, that's a kind of anecdote about the painting. So some people said, well, if she sort of looks unhappy, she looks like his spinster sister or something, or spinster daughter or whatever of the farmer. What we notice here, again, is a wonderful detail. The barn in the distance over the shoulder of the farmer. The individual little buttons and details of his garments. The wonderful braided apron and cameo worn by the woman. And they're all very realistic reflections of contemporary life in rural America at this time. This is a celebration of Americans. Thomas Hart Benton was born in Missouri in 1889. He also studied at the Art Institute of Chicago until he left for Paris to continue his training in 1913. Benton went on to serve in the U.S. Navy during the First World War as an artist. He was required to realistically document shipyard work and life. And that period of his life when he was required, given commissions to do very specific things that required a very realistic approach to drawing, would strongly influence the development of his style of painting. Benton embraced representational art, realism. He declared himself, in fact, quote, an enemy of modernism. He was articulate in attacking international, abstract, or non-objective styles of the modern movement. And he focused a lot of his criticism on Alfred Stieglitz, who, of course, continued to promote modernism, both in terms of American art and European art. He saw Stieglitz as the personification of all of the evils of a decadent world. In the name of a democratic art, Benton conceived of a monumental public mural style of painting that would show America in action. I'm showing you the interior of the Indiana Hall at the Century of Progress Exposition. This is a World's Fair in Chicago in 1933. Benton was commissioned to create a series of murals of Indiana life that were to be the state's contribution to the 1933 World's Fair. So this is an actual photograph of the hall in 1933. The paintings, since this time, they were stored after the World's Fair and then eventually end up at Indiana University, where they are exhibited today in about 3 different buildings. Around the walls of this hall, he created a whole cycle of murals representing the economic and the cultural history of Indiana. So, for instance, for the cultural history, he begins with the mound builders, the Native Americans, and then he comes forward all the way to the 1930s. And the same for the economic history of Indiana. And he really developed that realistic style that had begun with the drawing and the work that he had done in the Navy. He always felt that realism was the style of the average person, and that if you wanted people to understand what you were doing in your art, then it needed to be realistic. I want to show you just a couple of details from these murals. This one is from Industrial, Indiana, and it's actually part of one of the last murals. It's called Electric Power Motor Cars Steel. Benton is illustrating the development of natural resources to create an industrial economy. And then from those natural resources, people are building factories, steel and iron mills, and then working in those factories, in some cases on assembly lines. And in fact, we can see that in Indiana in the 1930s, they were building cars. So you can see a drawing here, and you can see the chassis, the wheel of a car that's on an assembly line being constructed. What I think I want you to notice is, despite the fact that he did not care for modernism in any form, that there is some degree of abstraction in terms of the figures, the scale, the relationship of foreground, middle ground, and background here, the simplification of certain elements within the work. It's really a very appropriate style for a mural. He gets you to look where he wants you to look. He moves you around within the work really quite brilliantly. One of the cultural murals that he created, it's probably, again, one of the last murals that he created, was called Parks, the Circus, the Klan, the Press. Interesting, you'd put all these things together, first of all. Some critics say that he had all of these different ideas and drawings for the murals, and these were the subjects that were left over, and so he put them all together, because one would be rather hard-pressed, perhaps, to see how these things all work together. It also includes firemen in the upper left-hand corner. One of the things that stood out here, and here you have the press, here the printing press, which of course is a crucial aspect of American democracy, the free press. But one of the things that really disturbed people, and in fact about 5 or 6 years ago, there was a big demonstration at Indiana University asking them to take this particular section of mural down because it was extremely offensive. And that's because he's given a prominent place to none other than the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan. That's what you see here. If you read about the history of the state of Indiana, it's rather interesting. Because you think of Indiana as a Midwestern state, not a Southern state where you assume the Klan was the strongest. But during the 1920s, 5 million Americans joined the KKK. Indiana had the largest Klan in the country, and the governor of Indiana between 1925 and 1929 was not only probably one of the most corrupt governors that state had ever seen, or any state had ever seen, was exceedingly anti anyone who was not white and Protestant, very anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, anti-black, and he, by the way, was a member of the Ku Klux Klan. This is the governor of the state of Indiana. So what is Benton doing here? Well, I think one could argue he's showing us a big part of the history of the state, that he's not celebrating it, but he's showing us something throughout the 1920s. Your governor is very high up in the KKK. Members of Congress whom you send to Washington are members of the KKK. This is part of the history of Indiana. And if you don't know about the Ku Klux Klan, they are white supremacists who wore white robes and hoods to hide their identity in order to intimidate and murder minorities or anyone who did not fit in to what they considered to be an American. And one of the things that critics always pointed to in this work, and it was considered, again, quite extraordinary at this time in 1933, is the integration of a hospital where you see the children in a pediatric ward, both a black child and a white child, being cared for side by side. So it is a fascinating, it is a very controversial mural. I have a really short, a 2-minute video produced by Indiana University. I don't know if it's going to give you any more. It's sort of a whitewash, which is a funny thing to say when you're talking about the KKK, but let's see. Oh, hold on.
Antiques Roadshow is sponsored by Liberty Mutual and Subaru. The mural panels hanging on the walls in Woodburn 100 are part of the 232-foot-long, 12-foot-high continuous mural painted by Thomas Hart Benton, one of the great public artists of the 20th century. The state of Indiana commissioned Benton to paint the murals as the centerpiece of Indiana's exhibition space at the 1933 Chicago Century of Progress World's Fair. Depicting a social history of Indiana, the murals follow two parallel streams representing the industrial and cultural history of the state. From the onset, the murals inspired controversy. Some critics found Benton's style too rough, distorted, and abstract, while others placed him in the vanguard of important American muralists. His populist images and depiction of striking workers led conservatives to accuse him of having socialist leanings. At the same time, liberals condemned his inclusion of the Ku Klux Klan, despite a scene of racial integration in an Indianapolis hospital on the same panel. Benton claimed that he merely tried to depict Indiana's history accurately. When the Century of Progress exhibition closed, Benton's murals were dismantled and stored in Indianapolis, eventually ending up in a horse barn on the state fairgrounds. In 1938, Indiana University President Herman B. Wells asked Governor Cliff Townsend to donate the murals to the university. Mary Josephine Davis, a member of the state committee that had commissioned Benton, helped convince the governor that this was a sound request. The governor shipped the murals to the Bloomington campus in December of 1939. Originally, the murals contained 26 panels. 16 of these were installed in the lobby of the IU Auditorium, 4 in the University Theater, and 2 in Woodburn Hall. Today, most people in the art community consider the Benton murals to be the single greatest artistic treasure on the Bloomington campus. Nevertheless, the controversy continues. Antiques Roadshow is sponsored by Liberty Mutual and Subaru. Antiques Roadshow, Monday.
Okay. So I thought that was rather interesting. It just illuminates the place of the works a bit more. Benton eventually returned to Missouri to teach at the Kansas City Art Institute to promote realistic regionalist painting. He had taught at the Art Students League in New York from 1926 to 1935. And while he was there, he was the teacher and mentor for a number of young, talented artists, including an artist named Jackson Pollock. We'll have more to say about him in just a moment. In 1935, into the 1940s, under President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the U.S. government established a federal art project, a subdivision of the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, which was a huge government-funded project to put people back to work. This is when the Hoover Dam was constructed. This is when many of the highways in this country and bridges were constructed. All of this through the WPA in order to create jobs for the unemployed labor force in America during the Depression. artists were put to work decorating public buildings and parks, and that literally helped them survive during the Depression years. A large number of young artists who worked for the Federal Art Project painted, created murals, designed posters, took photographs, and went on to establish America as the center of modern art after World War II. But the only reason they survived the 30s into the 40s is in part because they took part in a government program. In fact, some of the artists who took part in the Federal Art Project read like a who's who of the generation of modernist artists, particularly abstract expressionist artists. James Brooks, William Basiotis, Willem de Kooning, Arshile Gorky, Adolf Gottlieb, Philip Guston, Jackson Pollock, Lee Krasner, Mark Rothko. Unbelievable. Gives me goosebumps to read all of those names. In the 1930s to 1941, the Armenian painter Arshile Gorky, who had come to the United States, was employed by the Public Works of Art Project. One of his projects was to paint realistic aviation murals, historical murals, for the Newark, New Jersey Airport Administration Building. And there's been a lot of controversy about these murals as well, because some of them seem to have disappeared in part, and you can see some of them still today that have survived. So another artist who survived during the Depression through this government employment. By 1936, Gorky's own work, that is, he could create realistic murals, but his own work was moving toward greater and greater geometric abstraction. This was based on the influence of European modernism. It was based on the influence of surrealism through Juan Miró. It was based on the non-objective painting of Wassily Kandinsky. I remind you of Harlequin's Carnival, yes, that we looked at in 1924-1925 by Miró. We talked about Miró as one of those surrealist artists in the beginning whose art tended to be biomorphic and abstract, not the kind of realistic surrealism that we see in the work of someone like René Magritte or Salvador Dalí. Gorky is very much influenced by the formalism of Miró, and he creates a sort of surrealist scape that in some ways one can see as deriving from this knowledge and admiration for Miró. This is called "The Liver is the Coxcomb." What we see, again, is based in Miró, in Kandinsky, shapes and forms based in Dada, automatism, biomorphic surrealism, but now taken to another level, a different style. It has been described as having a very erotic quality to it, that there are male and female-like genitalia. The brilliant color contrast make Gorky immediately one of the great colorists of the almost now the second half or the middle of the 20th century. And one would have to say, in order to explain it, we look to surrealism, to the subconscious, to suppressed sexuality, to Freudian dream imagery, but again, moving increasingly toward the abstract approach to surrealist painting. The work of the surrealists and the work of artists like Kandinsky, who were increasingly known and embraced by American artists in the 1930s, serve as a kind of bridge for what will be an emerging American movement called abstract expressionism. By the end of World War II, that's 1945, Most European abstract and surrealist artists who had come to the United States to escape the war since the late 30s had returned to Europe. But abstract expressionism, an American movement based on American acceptance of European traditions of abstraction, began to grow in the 1940s. There was no unified style among the generation of abstract expressionists, but they emphasized the importance of the individual and the assertion of a unique voice. This is not something new in modern art. We have seen this basically since the 19th century, that artists are really no longer interested in supplying the patron with what the patron wants, but in fact in serving themselves and, in essence, what I just said, their own unique voices. Also important in the development of this new movement, abstract expressionism, was a philosophy known as existentialism. Existentialism was introduced into the lexicon of America soon after World War II from France. And it actually, although certainly Jungian and Freudian analysis and dream imagery is not going to disappear, ultimately existentialism becomes the kind of intellectual framework, the philosophy that artists are looking at to validate their art. So very basically, I'm not going to go into any great detail here because it's a complex philosophy. In existentialism, human beings, through their consciousness of themselves, create their own meaning in life. The existentialists basically declare that God is dead, so you have to create your own meaning. There's not a predetermined you. There's not a predetermined essence. You create yourself by encountering yourself, by experiencing what is important to you. And there is no meaning in the world beyond the meaning we give to it. In a sense, existentialism can be very pessimistic, but it can be very freeing as a philosophy. Take responsibility. So I'm just giving you a few points here. It's a 19th century philosophy that became popular at the end of World War II. It replaces Freudian and Jungian dogmas as an intellectual framework for artists. Jean-Paul Sartre, the French philosopher, is the one who said existence precedes essence. The reason for your existence on earth is determined by you. In other words, there is no God. And it emphasizes action, freedom, and decision-making. So you can choose to sit there, or you can choose to use that freedom that you have to create meaning. One could say that abstract expressionists believe in asserting themselves by self-definition, and in the case of our artists, in the conscious act of painting. And really, existentialism replaces surrealism and dream imagery and the unconscious. You have to be very conscious, very aware, very forward to be able to create your own meaning. In the fall of 1930, Jackson Pollock from Wyoming went to New York. And he enrolled, as I said a while back, in Thomas Hart Benton's class at the Art Students League. Benton was teaching life drawing, painting, and composition. When asked about his experience with this devout anti-modernist, Pollock said that he saw his teacher's art as, quote, something against which to react very strongly. He went on to say, Benton drove his realism at me so hard, I bounced right into non-objective painting. Pollock cultivated an identity as a Westerner who was uniquely independent and American. Although he continued to paint works into the early 40s that reference figures and objects, his works became increasingly abstract, creating a kind of ambiguity of meaning until by 1947, 1948, 49, and 50, Pollock has eliminated recognizable subject matter, using, in essence, the surrealist technique of automatism. He works spontaneously, pouring paint from the can, using sticks or hardened brushes over an unprimed piece of canvas, which he tacks down to the floor. And he walks around the painting and works on it from every point of view. Abstract expressionism evolves out of the painter's desire to concentrate on the act of painting, and as we've been saying for so long now, on the formal aspects of painting. Robert Motherwell, an extraordinary painter in his own right, said, quote, "The need is for felt experience, intense, immediate, direct, unified, warm, vivid, rhythmic." So painting and the act of painting is like defining your life, and it's of crucial importance that you become involved in it totally. Painting for Pollock, in a sense, has no real focal point, has no beginning or end, it has no front or back. It's all encompassing. It's a complete environment. It's closest, I suppose, to white on white of Malevich in the sense of the kind of spirituality and the rejection of the Renaissance concept of the window on reality. I found a great little video that was taken in 1951 of Pollock working, so I'm hoping that you can hear this well enough. He obviously is reading a script, but it's interesting because we actually see him at work.
My home is in Springs, East Hampton, Long Island. I was born in Cody, Wyoming, 39 years ago. In New York, I spent 2 years at the Art Students League with Tom Benton. He was a strong personality to react against. This was in 1929. I don't work from drawings or color sketches. My painting is direct. I usually paint on the floor. I enjoy working on a large canvas. I feel more at home, more at ease in a big area. Having the canvas on the floor, I feel nearer, more a part of the painting. This way I can walk around it, work from all four sides, and be in the painting. Similar to the Indian sand painters of the West. Sometimes I use a brush, but often prefer using a stick. Sometimes I pour the paint straight out of the can. I like to use a dripping fluid paint. I also use sand, broken glass, petals, string. A method of painting is the natural growth out of a need. I want to express my feelings rather than illustrate them. Technique is just a means of arriving at a statement. When I am painting, I have a general notion as to what I am about. I can control the flow of the paint. There is no accident. That is, there is no beginning and no end. Sometimes I lose a painting. But I have no fear of changes, of destroying the image. Because a painting has a life of its own, I try to let it live.
Really interesting. Okay, see you for the final.